All right, here's the thing. You probably check how many sales come through your website, but honestly, are you really paying attention to the stories that your analytics are telling you? What if I told you that hidden in those numbers could be insights that are going to reveal untapped markets, products your customers actually want, or even ways to cut spending? Well, if you've ever wondered, what should I even care about with analytics when I can see my sales numbers? You're going to want to listen to this week's episode.
This episode is brought to you by Metricool. From planning to publishing to understanding what's actually working, Metricool gives you data-driven control. And with their built-in AI tools and competitor tracking, you'll stop guessing and start growing. Just click the link in the show notes for 30 free days of premium access and make sure to use the code Katie30. All right, let's get into today's episode.
Welcome back to this week's episode of Rocky Mountain Marketing. Today, my guest is Philippa Gamse, and she is a digital marketing strategist with over 25 years of experience, and she's helped over 500 clients around the world find those hidden gems in their website analytics that, honestly, it's going to skyrocket your revenue. And Philippa's worked on websites that have collectively generated hundreds of millions of dollars. Yes, she is the person that you call when you're tired of guesswork. And so, Philippa, thank you so much for joining me on Rocky Mountain Marketing today.
Yes, hi, good morning or good afternoon.
Yeah, we've got connected, and with all of my guests, we do a pre-call, and we just kind of get to know each other. And Philippa and I were talking about digital marketing, and then we started talking about website analytics, and I got really excited because I was like, man, you have answers to questions that I didn't know that there were answers to. I didn't know that we could see some of these things. And so we're going to talk a lot about analytics today. So if you have ever been wondering about any of the how do I tell what's working and what's not, and how can I make more money? Like I said before, this episode is for you. So Philippa, so many entrepreneurs, they're looking at their sales numbers and they think that that's enough. Like, okay, well, I had this amount of sales calls or whatever. But I want to talk about why that is the wrong mindset when it comes to website analytics.
Right. Well, and basically it's a pretty straightforward question. Say you get, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 sales, whatever it might be, but whatever number it is, wouldn't you rather get more? I mean, there are very few businesses that are going to say no to that. So, if you're getting, say, hundreds and hundreds of visitors to your website, but you're only getting 3 sales, you might think your website is only capable of generating 3 sales, but is that really true?
And I think that that's where maybe we're not looking at the visitors the right way, right? Let's just talk about a time where maybe you were looking at analytics and you uncovered a huge opportunity, like something that a client might have completely missed otherwise.
Well, some of that is, it's not even opportunity necessarily. It's just stupid situations that one of the things I've noticed is that gremlins creep in. And so honestly, sometimes it's as simple as, look, there's a broken link here and this whole thing isn't working. But for example, I'll give you a story. My new book is coming out next week as we're recording this. I'm very excited about that. And here's a story from the book. I was working with a bus company in the northeast of the US, which was the preferred transportation provider for a major casino up there. And the casino, on their website, they had a link to this bus company, and their website said, this is our transportation provider of choice. And obviously for a lot of people, you're going to a casino, you're probably going to drink a fair bit, you probably don't want to be driving, right? So the bus company was obviously an important part of the experience. The bus company's website was horrendous. It had a homepage that was just so cluttered with so much stuff you couldn't really figure out. And a lot of it was stuff that is important to the bus company, but not necessarily to the audience, like, our safety record and what kind of tires we have on the buses. And I mean, yes, that's important. You want to know the bus is going to be safe. From the casino, you're basically wanting to know how to get to the casino, right? And so the link from the casino was to the homepage of the bus company. And there was absolutely nothing that clearly said how to get to the casino and all of that. And so what happened? When you look at the analytics, what do you think happened? All the people who came from the link from the casino, which we can identify those people, just left. Because they took one look at this thing and they were going, I have no idea how to use this. I have no idea where the information I want is, or if it's even here. I'm out. Right. And so what's the solution? I mean, once you know that's the problem, the solution is obvious, right? Create a landing page for the casino that the link from the casino goes to that says, welcome casino visitors. Here's our schedules. Here's how to book. Here's a voucher for 10% off your first ride, blah, blah. Boom, job done, right?
Yeah.
So, and all it was simply saying, why don't we have, and nobody had thought, why don't we have a dedicated page here?
Yeah, well, and that brings up like a great question, I think, is what is one of the most common mistakes or misconceptions that you see when people first start actually looking at their analytics? Because they probably were saying like, this is where we want people to go, done. And then they just check off like, oh, we're getting tons of website traffic. Nobody's just clicking the link. So what are some of the common mistakes or misconceptions that you see when like most often?
So, it's interesting because normally I would say bounce rate. So bounce rate is the people who leave your site immediately. On the other hand, of course, I've just told a story where bounce rate was the clue. Like, wait, all these people, actually what you would have to do to get that information, and this is something that a lot of people don't do, is to do a segment. So when we say segment in analytics, what we mean is figuring out if there's a particular type of visitor with particular characteristics that's exhibiting this behavior. Right, because if we'd looked at the bounce rate for the homepage, that's all the people who leave immediately. Depending on how many visitors there were overall, that bounce rate might have been quite low. But if we look at it specifically for visitors from that casino, which we can do, we can separate those out, then obviously it's almost 100%, and then we know we've got a problem. So one of the big things that people do wrong is treat all visitors like they're the same, because if you can drill down and say it's this type of visitor that's doing this, which might be good or bad, then you've got something you can look at. For example, social media advertising, that's one of my favorite things to say. A lot of business owners spend money on social media ads because they're not as expensive as Google and because people talk a lot about social media. And honestly, I can tell you from looking at a lot of analytics that if you look at the quality of the visitors, so that means not just how many people come from a social media ad, but then, what did they do? Did they stay? Did they look at your content? Did they convert or do the things you wanted them to do? The answer to that question is almost always no, not very many, as compared to other forms of marketing like organic search or that search people haven't paid for, right? Or email marketing, which is really the most valuable thing you can do with your own newsletter. And if you look at the relative quality of the visitors from different channels, which you can also do, then you can say, hey, maybe I shouldn't be spending so much on social media ads. Or maybe you can hone in on, hey, my visitors from Facebook are great, but the ones I get from, I don't know, TikTok are not. Right, I'm just throwing out examples, right? So being able to really say what's worth spending this money on and what isn't is really helpful and important.
And I think that one thing that you brought up was knowing who those people are. So for someone that's listening right now and they're like, man, I didn't really think I was looking deep enough. How do you help them figure out where people are coming from and who the right people are that are landing on their page? Because we can see like, okay, well, this amount of traffic is from organic search. This amount of traffic is from social or whatever. Where can we find, as a business owner, where can we find the numbers and the information to double down and go all in on those people that matter?
Right. So, it depends what tool you're using. Some analytics packages or tools are more sophisticated than others. I mostly work with Google Analytics. For example, in Google Analytics, there are a number of reports that will already break this out for you. But what you should be doing to get into this is to understand your own website really well. So this isn't about the analytics, it's about your business and the website. So what's your website trying to do? So each page of your site should be clear about what's the visitor supposed to do as a result of being here. Do you have calls to action, right? Do you direct them on to the next step of what you want them to do? Because a lot of websites don't do that well.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, then you're relying on the visitor to figure out what you want them to do, and they often don't. They don't do what you want them to do. So understanding what the outcomes that you're expecting are is really important, because then you can say, are we getting those outcomes? And if not, why not? And if not, can we drill down and can we say, well, how did these visitors get here? Where are they from? I mean, and it could be that, for example, you only serve a certain geographic area. Well, an analytics package like Google Analytics will tell you where geographically your visitors come from. So if you're attracting an awful lot of people from way outside your service area, then you can actually ask some different strategy questions like, is there anything we can do to serve those people? so that we don't just turn them away, or are they really useless to us, right?
I love a lot of what you're saying, Philippa, because it's very in alignment with the 4-post strategy that we do on social media for our clients. It's always, what's the end goal? What do we want people to do here? And honestly, like, how many sales are you getting from your about page? Well, how many could you get from your about page? How is it positioned? And what you're talking about is really taking a strong look at what the intention is behind every page of your website and how can you get people to make that purchase based on who visits that that page regularly.
Right. And when you say about page, that's an interesting point, because people don't necessarily buy stuff at your about page, and maybe that's not the point of the page. But what I can say, one of the things your website has to do is it has to establish trust. So if I've come to your website and I don't know who the heck you are, one of my first questions is, can I trust you to do what you say you can do? And I can tell you that people who are new to the site go to the about page to say, well, who is this business? Who am I going to meet? Who am I going to encounter? What are their claims, or what's the proof that they know what they're doing? And if there isn't an about page, or if it is really generic and, for example, it doesn't name any names, or you can't find any sort of address, or you can't contact anybody, I think all those things are barriers that put people off from that important trust aspect. Because we have to think about this process. We have to think about the fact that very few people buy on their first visit, because they have to figure out who you are and what you do, and do they like you, and who else is out there. Right. And we tend to think of our site like somebody's supposed to land on this page, go to this page, and this page, and then buy something. And it just doesn't work that way. And so actually, when we're looking at analytics, one of the other mistakes that I think a lot of people make is they do look at the acquisition, that is, how do I get somebody to the site? Because you're typically spending money on that, or you're putting some effort into it. And then they look at the end result, which is the conversion, which makes the revenue, which obviously is also important. But what they forget is the whole range of stuff in the middle, which is that piece where people are figuring that out. Do I trust them? What are they doing? Do they have something I want? Maybe they're reading your blog. Maybe they're watching your videos or your podcasts, right? Are they actually consuming that content? There's a piece where you're trying to build relationship. And a lot of people, when they're looking at the analytics, they don't focus on that piece at all, but it's actually really key.
So if you had to just pick 3 metrics or 3 analytics that people should be watching like a hawk, what would they be and why?
Honestly, my preferred answer to that would be it depends, because I hate generic advice, to be honest, because a lot of time you've really got to be very familiar with your own situation, because that's the only way. Otherwise, the numbers of reports and data and everything is just off the charts overwhelming.
There's just numbers. Okay,
right.
Here's all these numbers. What do I do with them?
But if you can come in there with a question, so, okay, you understand what the page is trying to do or what the site is trying to do. So then the question is it doing it? And if not, why not? And where do I expect something to be happening? Or what's going on here? What's going on with this page? I've just put a new podcast up. Is anybody listening to it? And one of the things you can do is to you can dive into videos and podcasts and say, yes, X number of people press the start button, but how many people listened all the way through? Because lots of people don't, right? Unless it's interesting. So things like that. And honestly, I think that the other thing is you shouldn't just measure for measurement's sake, because what's the point, right? You only really want to measure stuff that you want to do something about. So you don't want to have 100 metrics that you're following at one time, because what are you going to do with that information? How can you tease out from 100 different metrics something that you need to pay attention to? Because the only point of measuring anything is if you're going to do something about it. Right? So if you find that maybe a call to action isn't very effective, you're going to hopefully test different ways of presenting it, different places to put it. But if you're just looking at numbers for numbers' sake, you can't do that. You can't say, well, what can I actually do that will improve the performance here?
And I think that, as you mentioned earlier, you have a brand new book that just came out this week. And tell us a little bit about the book. Where can people find it? Where can they get it?
Thank you. It's called Website Wealth, a business leader's guide to driving real value from your analytics. And the point of the book is to do what we're doing here, which is, we're not using a whole load of techie jargon. I'm not out here to train people in using any particular analytics package, because honestly, there's really good information out there that already does that. What I'm trying to do is to talk to business owners about what you need to know to think strategically in business terms about your website and how it's performing and if your marketing's working. And if you need to, don't try to do this for yourself if it's really not something that excites you. But, get somebody like me in so that I can make sure you're set up properly, give you some initial ideas, show you what to look for. There are people like me around, right? But you need to be able to talk to us about your business because I don't understand your business anything like you do.
Yeah.
So the book is really designed for, and it's got lots and lots of stories and examples of things to think about in business terms, not techie terms, about what your site should be doing for you.
So with the book, and I know we've given a couple, examples, and, I wanted the 3 metrics that I should just be looking at, selfishly. That was a selfish question, but it's true. Like there is no just you could say, well, Katie, you should be looking at this, this, and this, but those 3 things might be very different for someone that owns a local coffee shop. And it might be something that's completely different for a real estate agent. It all comes down to what is your end goal. And I think that with what you said earlier about knowing what the end goal is for each page is huge. What is the purpose of this page? So when you start working with someone, what are some of the first bits of advice that you give them as they kind of build out the why behind their website?
Right. Well, obviously, when I first start working with somebody, one of the things that I will do is to make sure the analytics are properly implemented. And so, for example, if you look at something like Google Analytics, it's got some default settings out of the box that make no sense to me at all. For example, it will keep your data for all of 2 months. And so if you're a marketer and you want to know what's our performance, quarter on quarter, you can't do that if you've only got 2 months worth of data, right? I don't know why they have this setting, but one of the first things I do is go in, and you've only got 2 options actually for this setting. One is 2 months and one is 14 months. So, but I always change it. I think it's probably data privacy issues, but making sure that the data is coming in, and then you can customize. So one of the other things that I see a lot now is long pages on websites, because especially designed for mobile, people prefer to keep swiping and swiping, right? But if they don't, and you've got important content way down on a page, you want to know that, because if people aren't seeing important content or important calls to action, that's something you should know. And you can't tell that without looking at some sort of analytics. So one of the things you can do with a program like Google Analytics is to set up custom events, which will measure when somebody, for example, is more than 25% down the page or more than 50% down the page. The analytics as it comes out the box will only measure 90% down, which is, if you're on a long page, that's already a lot of scrolling.
Yeah.
So customizing for that business. So I'll talk to the business owner and we'll talk about what are you trying to do here and what are your goals and who are your markets. And then customizing where necessary so that we get a really good picture of what's going on. So, there's quite a lot of detailed setup that you can do that's very individualized to each business.
So, Philippa, I want to hop in the DeLorean. Let's get in and go back to the future, because I remember it's interesting to go back and look at pictures of how websites used to be, how they were set up. It's still shocking to me when I come across a website and it hasn't been optimized for mobile. But I mean, everything is always changing. ChatGPT, AI, it is changing things as well. How have analytics changed over the past few years, like with with AI coming out? I think that we're kind of in the wild, wild west right now. So how have you seen things change just over the past few years? And then where do you see them going?
So obviously there's a lot of talk about AI. And these days AI can help with analytics because it can draw beautiful charts and graphs that would take me ages. And obviously it can analyze trends and patterns and stuff like that. I think the debate is still, hopefully there's still a need for people like me that come along and say, okay, so we understand what's going on. What are we going to do about it? And again, that's going to depend on all sorts of things that maybe the AI can't yet. I don't know. Everybody's now saying, well, yes, but next year it will. It's funny because actually years and years ago, before Google Analytics, one of the reasons I got interested in analytics was because it was a brilliant tool that was invented by a friend of mine. I live in Santa Cruz, California, and it was really graphically, the interface was wonderful. And it could do a lot, especially for a small business that doesn't necessarily want to get incredibly detailed analytics, but wants to know what's going on. I love this program. And of course, it was called ClickTracks. And of course, it wasn't free because, it was a business and they had to make money. And then Google Analytics came along, which was free, and that was that. But it's funny because when you said, where's analytics going? Obviously right now we would think it's way more sophisticated than anything we've ever had before. And it probably is, except that there's this one program that I still miss. Because I think it was, graphically, it was so much easier, and intuitively, it was so much easier to use. I mean, there's no way I'm going to sit here and claim that Google Analytics is easy to use.
Yeah, you were talking about the scroll, triggers and everything. I'm like, man, I never even thought about that. Like that's, especially like with, people that maybe they have an online course or they're utilizing the ClickFunnels kind of formula for their websites and stuff, and where there's a lot of information on that first page. I never even thought about that. So I know we're kind of going down the AI rabbit hole here, but I know that a lot of people aren't even going to websites anymore because AI can give them the answer when they type it into the Google search bar. So what are you recommending people do to kind of future-proof themselves and their business and their websites?
Right. And I should say I'm not an SEO. That's not what I do. So I don't know. I mean, yes, AI is really, really helpful to get a quick answer for something. If you're looking for something more in depth, hopefully we're still going to click on the individual websites to get that detail.
Do you see people making better copy on their websites?
I think it's so hard to. Yes, I mean, I've written some copy using AI myself.
Do you feel like with kind of what's the end goal for this web page? Do you feel like people are taking better copy and putting it onto their websites now because AI is crawling all of these different web pages, and so they're trying to get as much bang for their buck out of like, oh, if AI crawls just this one page, I want to make sure that the person knows as much about me as possible.
Right, but you kind of don't know exactly what the AI is going to put together from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I think I'm just stumbling here because I do have very mixed feelings about the whole thing. And, I mean, it's just off topic. I was reading an article yesterday where they interviewed high school teachers and university teachers about the use of AI in education now and how the problem is that it's making people less able to think for themselves. And, if you can just generate an essay that the professor isn't going to know whether or not you wrote it, but you've not actually had to put any thought into it. Is this creating better human beings? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and it's like I always say to my clients, and if we have AI creating all of our content and then there's AI bots that can do responding and it's just AI talking to AI, and like, where's the human element?
Right.
So we're in a really interesting time right now. And I think that with everything that we're doing, we can use AI as that power partner, that business bestie to help us, I think, with what you're saying, creating better web pages to know, okay, well, what's the end goal for this? And then now that I have that, what metrics can I track? What's converting for these? Is organic search really converting on this page? Really looking at that information.
And again, as I said, I think once you get into deeper content, like AI, if you put this podcast on your website, people are going to come to your website to watch it, right? If the question is a website's going away, then hopefully the answer to that is no. People do still come to websites, right? And Google is obviously not on one search page going to be able to put everything out of any given website. So as I said, hopefully quick answers, yes. More in-depth answers, websites are still very much appropriate.
So when someone picks up your book and they're like, man, I didn't even touch the tip of the iceberg with everything in your book here. But if someone picks it up and they say, okay, well, this is what I want to walk away with. What will people walk away with after grabbing your book and really rethinking how they're approaching their websites and the analytics to be looking for?
Yes. And hopefully what it is really is a guide for business owners in how to think about the site, what questions to ask, to think strategically about what your expectations are, what you're trying to do, who you're trying to attract, and then things to look for in the analytics or things to talk to your analyst about, how to choose the right analyst, because there are people, and I shouldn't, but there are, for example, some agencies where they're really good at things like the social media and the SEO, but they say they do analytics, but they're really only doing what we call the vanity metrics, which is that they can get away with saying, look, we got you more visitors this week than we did last week, and therefore we're doing our job. And the business owner maybe isn't sophisticated enough to say, yes, but are they the right visitors, which is the point, right? So, you talked about what are we trying to do here and is that happening? So my goal is to get the business owner to understand this is what analytics can do, show me if my website's performing well. This is what I need to think about. This is what I can offload to an analyst, because I'm not expecting the business owner to get to grips with the actual analytics unless they want to. But if they don't want to, here's what they need to do. And here's what they need to think about.
Well, if people want to pick up your book, tell them where to do that. Where's the best way for them to grab your new book?
Well, probably Amazon, as usual.
And we'll include a link in Amazon, too, in the show notes here.
Great, yeah. And it will obviously be available on Kindle, and there's a paperback version, so whichever you prefer.
Amazing. And if people want to connect with you on social media and learn more or work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
So my favorite, I'm basically a LinkedIn person. So I love connecting with people on LinkedIn. And on my website, there's also a free ebook, which is called 5 Hidden Gems. And it's 5 stories that are in the published book, but this is a free book. And it's, again, just designed to come up with 5 stories from my experience, things that we saw in analytics that we could not possibly have otherwise known, and how we made a big change to either the business or the website because of that. And that's on my website, which is websitesthatwin.com. And anybody can go and download that.
Amazing. Well, for anyone that's been ignoring their website's data, hopefully this episode has given you the motivation to go back in, look at what's working. The numbers, honestly, they might just be holding the key to doubling your revenue, and whether launching that next big product or even really discovering your next big market. So, Philippa, I want to thank you again so much for joining me. And if you want to connect with her, please be sure to do so. And as always, thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Rocky Mountain Marketing.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of Rocky Mountain Marketing. I hope you're leaving with valuable insights and the inspiration to lead your market. If you've enjoyed our time together and found today's podcast episode useful, I have a small favor to ask of you. Please hit that subscribe button to stay updated with the latest episodes. And if you know someone who could benefit from these episodes, maybe a fellow business leader or an aspiring entrepreneur, go ahead and share this episode with them. Let's spread the knowledge and grow together. Also, I'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation beyond the podcast. Visit me at katiebrinkley.com to connect, to find more resources, or just to share your journey. And be sure to pick up your copy of my new book, The Social Shift, at katiebrinkley.com/book. Thanks again for tuning in. I'm Katie Brinkley, and I can't wait to dive into more strategies and stories with you on the next episode of Rocky Mountain Marketing. Let's keep on taking your marketing to new heights.